Home Landscape Gardening is a University of Minnesota Television independent study course presented in continuing education and extension. To enroll for university credit, listen to the announcement at the end of the program. Home Landscape Gardening, a course designed to help the home gardener learn basic principles. The course is taught by C. Gustav Hard, Professor of Horticultural Science at the
I suppose that most remember a small child and you first time and ball and threw it rather awkwardly. You sort of wondered, well, gee, how did I do? We do the same thing. Very often we begin those gardening tasks and we wonder about what are the rules of the game and this sort of thing. Where do I go from here? And we make those mistakes too. And the idea of learning more about gardening is sure that we limit the number of the mistakes that we do and also play the game just as good as we can. In this way, we'll find that as we walk through the whole series of programs in gardening, that our skills are going to improve. We're going to find that the game is going to be fun, and we're going to find also that some of the revelation of the things that go on with plants because we begin to learn more about plants. And this is some of the material that we're going to be working with in terms of landscape gardening. Another thing I want to mention as we go along is that it's not enough to just know how plants grow, where they grow and why they grow and how we can help them to grow, but we have to take that extra step. That extra step is really getting into the game. And so often we sort of feel rather reluctant and simply say to ourselves, well, I'm not sure I can do that, or I'll wait till tomorrow, or maybe you simply just say, well, I'm not sure, but maybe I'll kill the plant. And we don't want to do that. We really want to think about plants in terms of success. But nevertheless, we come to that point where we've got to say to ourselves, I got to get into the game. I've got to get in there and play it for all that I'm worth. And we can do that, and we can have the confidence. Then we can begin to do those things with plants that's necessary in order to make them to grow. For example, one of the things that we look at in terms of making any diagnosis, and that is that as we see a plant that's in trouble, then we begin to say, well, now what went wrong with that plant? Have they been giving it too much water? Not enough? Have I fertilized it too much? Is the light right? What's the problem? Well, very often we have to take it out of the pot, for example, and say to ourselves, well, how are the roots? And we struggle, and maybe we can get it out, and maybe we can't. But if you can't get it out, then we got to give it the works. We've got to have the courage to go ahead and get the plant out of the pot so that we can see what the problem is. And here's a good example of one of those times when the root system has just absolutely disintegrated simply because the roots are too compacted in the pot. We were not able to get enough water in there. We couldn't get good absorption of the nutrients down to the root system where it would do good. And the other thing is that we might water and then suddenly find within maybe an hour or two that the plant is beginning to wilt simply because there's so much roots in the pot that we can't do a good job of watering. And so it is with many of the plants that we might be growing. The thing we need to know in terms of plants is that we need to know what a good, healthy plant looks like. In talking to many gardeners, you ask them, well, when did this plant start to have problems? And they say, well, I don't really know. Well, that's no answer, really. We have to know when a plant looks in a good, healthy condition. For example, I have this one here. This is a peperomia, And you notice the quality of foliage, the fact that it's beginning to show some flowering characteristic. It's lustrous, it's turgid, it has all the good characteristics we want. Usually these plants look this way when they come from the florist shop. They've been grown under intensive, high quality. All of its needs have been taken care of in turn by professional gardeners in the greenhouse. And then, by way of contrast, let's look at this other one, same kind of plant. The leaves are wilted, they're small, they don't have the same kind of characteristics that the original plant has. Well, as soon as we begin to see this variation away from what the plant looked like originally, or what it looks like under good culture, then we should begin to become suspicious that something is going wrong. Not enough light, not enough water, too much water, not enough fertility, not too much fertility, and so forth. So we need to sort of monitor plants on a day-to-day basis. You've heard about talking to plants. Well, we need to talk to plants. We need to say, well, how are you today? Let them know that we're around, so to speak. But what you're really doing is you're saying to that plant, are you in the same condition as you were yesterday? Is there something you need? Do you need to be watered? Do you need to be fertilized? Do you need a warmer temperature? What do you need on a day-to-day basis? Now, obviously, you're not going to make the rounds every day, but we do need to set up that kind of pattern of plant care. Now, so far we've been talking about indoor plants. The same thing occurs out of doors. We need to know when a tree is beginning to show symptoms of insects or disease or lack of water or fertility. The same principle applies. It's that matter of monitoring plants in order that we can grow them correctly. Now, there's another thing that we might want to keep in mind, and another plant here that we can look at in relationship to growing plants indoors. The plant that we have here has been growing in an apartment. You may ask the question, well, how do we know what is wrong with this particular plant? Well, there are several things that we can look at just from a diagnostic point of view. The first one is the change in the leaf pattern. You notice that this leaf has no lobing or there are no holes in it. Well, that's not quite the way it was. If you look down lower on the plant, we see that the leaf originally had lobing in it. So that something has changed from the time that the plant was brought into the home until its current condition. This might be a change of light. Then we can go on to one other symptom here, and you'll find that on the nodes, that is where the leaf bases are, that we have one about 7 to 8 inches here, and then as we look on down the plant, we find that node, when it was growing under good conditions, was only about 1.5 inches to 2 inches long. This is a factor that involves light, so that without too much of a problem, we can decide that the plant itself is probably not getting as much light as it should be. Another thing that we can say about the plant is that we have about 10 feet of plant and only about 1 gallon of soil, which means that we have a lot of foliage, we need a lot of water, we need a lot of nutrients, but we need, first of all, that soil to sustain both nutrients and water over an extended period of time. So that when we go back now to summarize what we've seen with the plant, first of all, we're looking at the manufacture of food, photosynthesis. We're looking at water, which might have to do with translocation, which is a word that we'll talk about a little bit later, that is movement of water. We find also there could be a temperature relation, which might have to do with respiration. And then we also have the problem of nutrient absorption. When we look at all of these physiological processes that this plant has to have in perfect balance, then we begin to understand the things that we have to know about the physiology in order to make it work for plants. Back at the bench, I have a few radish seedlings which I've germinated. Actually, I germinated this for a very special reason. That is to demonstrate what is involved nutrient absorption. So often, as we discussed a few minutes ago, when we look at the roots of plants, we see rather heavy material that we can see, we can feel, and we can look at. But there's more to this nutrient absorption than just what we see normally in terms of the roots. First of all, we have to keep in mind that what is happening is that the soil is providing a reservoir of nutrients and water and air, actually, for the plant. And that this has to move through the roots, through the cell walls, into the plant before it can be effective. And there are certain things that control this kind of phenomena. One is the matter of air in the soil, and the other has to do with adequate amount of water in order for it to move. And if we look at the root system here of this radish, you'll see that there's rather an extensive root system in relationship to the entire plant. These were germinated about 3 days ago, and we find that all the way from here down here, about 4 times the size of the plants is already made up of the root system. So we find that this is very extensive. Another thing that we want to keep in mind relating to that, that all along what we see here at the root are what are called root hairs, and these are only 1 cell thick. And these we can see microscopically if we get under magnification. The root hair does a lot of magnificent things. As you can see, it's a very, very thin layer, and you can also see the activity that's going on inside. These are part of the cell content you see, plus nutrients, plus the nucleus, all together controlling what's happening in the system. You'll find that as the nutrients get into it, we understand how this root system is sensitive to the things that we do. How, if we over-fertilize, that we can destroy that sensitive membrane, or how if we don't have enough water, that it's not going to be turgid enough to give a good nutrient absorption. And also it's affected by pH, it's affected by soil temperatures. So that there are all of these factors together then control the nutrient absorption into the plant. Looking at photosynthesis. Photosynthesis, first of all, has to take place only in the presence of sunlight. It does not in the dark. So that's one of the pieces that we have to look at the leaves on the plant. First of all, we have to think of the leaves of the plant as being a source of manufacture. That within the cell we saw with the root hair, there is billions of cells in the leaves which can carry on this magnificent operation of photosynthesis. You can look at it in a model form, such as where we're putting together the building blocks of photosynthesis. We find that we have sunlight, we have the chloroplast, which is the matter in the leaves, and then the sunlight activates the chlorophyll along with the dioxide and water, and we come up then with simple sugar. This sugar then is moved about in the plant and becomes more complicated starches, other foods with the plant structure itself. So we have this very sensitive kind of process in photosynthesis. Not only do we have to look at the building blocks, and I want to re-emphasize those, the chloroplast, sunlight, carbon dioxide, but we have to be sure that these are there in the right amounts. We have to be sure that there's a good source of carbon dioxide. For example, research has shown that where we can enrich the air around the plant with carbon dioxide, that we can actually get more growth than we can where we do not have, let's say, or where we have the average amount of carbon dioxide in the air. Though this would not necessarily be a practical thing on a homeowner's basis. Certainly in commercial use, there are areas where the carbon dioxide atmosphere is beneficial. But one thing we can do is to be sure that the plants that we are growing have adequate amount of sunlight. And we have a wide the requirements there. For example, the plant that we have here before us, which is a Chinese evergreen, requires relatively low level of light to do a good job for us within the home. And we might say that if we're looking then for a plant going to be growing in the darkest location that we might have, I said darkest, which simply is a way of saying we do still have to have light, but where the light is very limited, then this particular plant would do very well. Looking at the other extreme, we can go over here to some of the cacti, and you'll find that these have to have a maximum amount of sun. They need all the sun that we can provide to do very, very well. If we can do this, then again, you'll find that with this kind of plant, that we can choose those and use them in the south window or a west window, which is the source of light in the home where we have the most to work with. In this way, we're looking at the two extremes as far as light is concerned. Now, an intermediate might be the Schefflera. The Schefflera will grow where it doesn't have full sun, but it will grow, let's say, opposite a south or west exposed window. Or in the summertime, we might have good light in the morning, or in the afternoon, you'll find that it will do very well there. Again, symptoms, we're looking about healthy plant, is that of a lushness of foliage, green, glossy. These leaves have not been treated with any waxes. It's just a healthy growing condition that normally would happen where the light requirements are met and where the plant is able to express itself to its fullest. In other words, giving it good nutrition and good light make a lot of difference in terms of the culture of the plant itself. Now, where photosynthesis is a part of the physiological makeup of the plant, one of the many processes that we're discussing here, we find that this is probably the most sensitive and where we can probably do one of the major adaptations as far as healthy plants are concerned. We can always shift plants, or we can provide them with supplemental light if necessary in order for photosynthesis to take place. The point about photosynthesis, and that is this, that we can say, well, plant manufactures its own food. And as you pick up plant food materials in a garden center or florist shop, you'll say plant food on it. What are we talking about? Is this going to supplement low light or inadequate light as far as the plant is concerned? The answer is no. Plant food can only provide for the basic nutritional needs, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, which are taken in through the roots, and not necessarily provide for its well-being in terms of the food that it needs to manufacture when the process of photosynthesis takes place. The next plant function that we ought to talk about is translocation. And in this geranium, we can look at some very important points relating to that. Actually, translocation is just exactly what the word says, translocation. It simply says you have to get the food that the plant has manufactured to the various locations in the plant. In other words, if it's done here in the leaves, it has to move down the petiole and down into the root system or up into the flower system. Also true is the movement of those nutrients that we talked about a few moments ago that are coming in the bottom of the plant. They have to move up into the leaves so that the right nutrients are there to do their job as part of the growth process as well. We have this movement through the system, as I call it, of the plant, which is actually the xylem and the phloem, moving around in the plant doing this particular job. All the food materials move up and down through what we call the phloem. The water is important to keep everything turgid and moves through the xylem tissue in the plant itself. Now, if, for example, the plant is allowed to wilt, then you can see how we get into trouble as far as what's going to happen in terms of the movement of these nutrients around and in the plant. Another point about water is this, that you'll recall that water was a part of the molecule that was necessary to make the carbohydrates. So that again, if we lose a good water supply, then we're going to reduce the amount of photosynthesis that can take place. Another point relating to water, and that is that the little stomata, which are on the lower side, the majority at least are on the lower side of the leaf, will close as soon as the plant becomes wilted or in a wilted condition. Again, this means that the carbon dioxide is not going to get into the plant, and we're going to lose this turgidity. When the plant is turgid, the stomata are open, and also, I should say, all during the day when there is light. However, they do tend to close up during the evening so that there's no photosynthesis taking place, but we also have no light to energize the system in the leaf during the nighttime either. So translocation is an important part of the whole process of movement of the photosynthesis in and around the plant. I'm using the flowering crabapple to illustrate the plant function of respiration. We just got through talking about how the plant is able to move the photosynthates into various parts. Here we see it in the fruit of the flowering crabapple. Actually, inside of here are the little seeds, and these are going to be storing food, and this will then be carried over until the next season. And this is how plants are able to reproduce themselves from time to time. We see in the garden seeds, many of the things that we eat, like beans and peas and so forth. This is stored food, and when the appropriate conditions are then available, then these seeds will begin to grow, like water, light, and air again. Also, within the plant, we have this process of respiration taking place, giving up energy for the growth and development of the plant. And this is why it is necessary in the root system for this to be taking place. When we look at such things as the rhizomes, or if you want to call it, of the iris, which are very flaky, this is all stored food. And again, it's there all winter long, and then in spring, when the temperatures begin to warm, then the nutrients are freed up again, and they move back into the plants and the foliage for this process to take place. So this to look at as a very important part of our whole management of horticultural plants. The next process that we want to discuss is that of transpiration. Transpiration is the loss of water from the plant. Basically, that takes place from the foliage. And again, it takes place from the lower side of the leaf for the most part, and through stomates. Occur here both on the lower side, the majority here, but some also on the upper side of the leaf. Now, because this occurs as water vapor leaving the plant, we find that whenever the temperature is accelerated or above normal, or if we have wind moving over the surface of the leaf, we're going to have a greater rate of loss through transpiration than if we had it just in a calm area with a temperature for the kind of plant that we're trying to grow. Then we also have plants that make special adaptation, like this bishop's cap cactus. This is actually filled with water, but it has this waxy cutinous layer over the plant itself in such a way that very little water can escape. I think what should be said also that in the desert where many of these grows, it's not too much water available at the same time. So this is why that in association with the amount of sunshine that cactus requires, it does get by on a minimum amount of watering. In fact, this is one of the reasons why it's very easy to overwater the cactus when we're growing in the home. So this then gives us the total as far as the physiological processes that take place in plants. Just to go back over and review them briefly, we have photosynthesis, we have respiration, transpiration, translocation, and not the least of all, that of nutrient absorption. When we put all of these together and we balance them out, then we're beginning to talk about good plant management. And we have to keep in mind that each plant, coming from various parts of the world, coming from various climates of the world, all have to be given this kind of consideration. So this is why I say, as I mentioned earlier, we have to know what plants need on a day-to-day basis, on a season-to-season basis, and we work with the physiology of the plant in order to make this happen. Now that we know the plant functions, now we can go back again to point number 1 in the program. You'll recall that I was saying that once we understand plants and how plants grow, we still have that problem of saying to ourselves, all right, now this is what has to be done. If we have to look at the root system and we have to crack that pot to get them out of the pot and examine them, we have to do. Later on, when we're talking about plant propagation and we're starting to cut up plants and make cuttings out of them, if we have to do that, then we've got to have that courage and the know-how to go ahead and do those kinds of tasks. If it's a matter of transplanting, destroying root systems, and this type of thing, in order to make more plants and more beautiful plants, we're going to have that fortitude in order to do it. The other point I was making was that of knowing what it is a good, healthy plant looks like. And as you can see, with all the physiological functions that we have, and with the things that we have to do, we have to know where that fits in as far as the plant culture is concerned. What kinds of functions are going to be involved with particular kinds of symptomologies? This we need to do. So with this in mind, if we can keep the physiological processes in mind, the requirements of the plants in mind, then I think we can do a good job of practicing horticulture in the landscape.
Landscape Gardening is a University of Minnesota Television independent course. To enroll for 4 credits, telephone during business hours 376-4925 or write TVIS 27 Westbrook Hall, 77 Pleasant Street Southeast, University of Minnesota, Minneapolis, Minnesota 55455. If you wish to follow the program systematically by purchasing a study guide, you may do so by calling 376-4925. Home Landscape Gardening, University of Minnesota Television Independent Study Course, presented by Continuing Education and Extension. To enroll for university credit, listen to the announcement at the end of the program. Home landscape gardening to help gardeners and gain confidence in basic principles of horticulture. The course is taught by C. Professor of Horticultural Science and Landscape Architecture at the University of Minnesota.
What occurred when I was preparing this lecture for really why we want to grow plants in such an environment as the home. It's too dry, it's too cold, it's too late, it's too dark, and so forth. The only answer I come up with is the fact that most of you really want to grow plants. You want to have that greenery around the home. You want to use those plants for accents. You want to have some living material in your environment. And that's reason enough, I think, to take a very serious look at in plants, how we might go about making those modifications to grow them. In our earlier discussion, we talked about the physiology of plants and how plants grow. I think with understanding, we begin to solve problems that we have with the home and the environment within the home as far as growing plants are concerned. And this is going to be the primary thrust of the lesson today in order that we can begin to unravel these problems and make the whole idea of growing plants that is pleasurable and most importantly successful. If we can do this, then I think we're going to get the most out of growing plants. One of the first things that we want to look at is that matter of light. Light is an important part to the whole process of photosynthesis, that is, growing of plants so that they can manufacture much of the food so that they will grow under the light conditions we have in the home. And to help explain this, look at it in detail, I brought a model into the studio that we can look at some of the various orientations. This model is actually of a real live home. You'll notice that we have various room orientations. For example, on the south side we have a living room, 2 bedrooms. On the west side facing, we have a window to the west. Also on the west side, a north window. We have that kind of orientation. And then in the kitchen, the north window, dining room window, and then the family room porch is a north window and east window. Now we can ask the question, well, what difference does that make? Well, the difference that various plants have different light requirements. When we're looking at the home and analyzing what kind of plants we can put in various windows, we know where the house fits. So in our particular situation, we would find the south has the greatest amount of light, so we're looking for plants which has the most amount of light, require the most amount of light. The cactus happens to be one of those that requires a lot of light, and also, we might add, likes a warm temperature. The zea plant is another that could be grown in the south window or west window. We might add that as a category, most flowering plants prefer to have full sun, that is south exposure or west exposure. They have the longest period of light under those two locations, plus the greatest amount of light intensity. Recall where the sun is when it's on the south side, it's at the greatest angle and gives us the greatest amount of light. Moving around to the north, I've used the African violet, incidentally, to illustrate a flowering plant for orientation. There are a number of plants that can be used for that purpose, and we'll get into that a little bit later. But the African violet for the north side, the Chinese evergreen, and aspidistra, a lot of other plants. Then going over to the east, we might say we have an intermediate amount of light. It's the filtered morning sun that we get on the east side. And in this particular home, it would be coming through this window here. So we want to orient our plants to that location. Those might want to have an intermediate amount of light. So the first step in analyzing your home for what kind of plants that you might want to grow is to consider and where you're going to grow them. Which window? I want to plant for the south Okay, say they're going to be in this bay window down here. We can grow plants that would require and do best under heavy or maximum amount of light in the home. And you go through the home, through the bedrooms, even the bathroom, or the kitchen, into the dining room, or into the family room. Where does the room have a relationship to south, east, north, or west? Then you can make that decision as to what kind of plant you can grow where as far as light is concerned. Then you're going to get maximum amount of performance in response to the light with the plant. Photosynthesis, one of our points we want to hang on to, will be done in the presence of light as far as the plants are concerned. The next thing we want to look at is that of moisture. And this is a complicated one. I indicated earlier, moisture is at a minimum under most home conditions. When you think of the fact that in the wintertime we're heating, this is to lower the humidity. In the summertime, for air conditioning, this is to lower the humidity. Most prefer to have a relative humidity of about 50 to 60%. Well, you say, well, how do I know this? Well, I've got an answer here for you. It happens to be a hydrometer, which just measures the relative humidity. Relative humidity is a matter of the percentage of moisture in relationship to the temperature in the room. And most homes will have a temperature somewhere around 68 wintertime, 66 perhaps. Sometimes we drop it down in the evening hours. And then in the summertime, we get a greater degree of fluctuation, so that temperature goes up to maybe 8 degrees in the home if we're air conditioning. Then the relative humidity is going to drop. You can see that our watering pattern is going to follow temperature and relative humidity. And unless we have the right sensitivity to temperature, then we're going to run into some problems. We have to think along with the plant the temperatures are, because it's going to change our watering patterns. Now, another aspect of watering is that of the kinds of containers that we might use. And I have two plants here, identical as far as their age is concerned. Now, this one is in problem, having a real problem. This one is doing very, very well. Both of them happen to be the pear plant. There's nothing significant in the name of the plant here, except that I want to point out the volume of soil here that this plant has. Just maybe about 4 to 6 tablespoons full of soil for this much plant. Here we have at least 2 cups of soil. Well, as you can see, the volume of water that these 2 plants are going to hold, as far as the container is concerned, is going to be relate to the frequency of water and also the duration that the watering is going to last. This plant is very easy to neglect simply because we're watering this one, let's say, on a 3 to 4 day sequence. This one might, in a hot day, need watering twice one day. Well, we're not very likely to remember to do that. And this is a problem that we have to work with in terms of providing watering. Another aspect of that is I want to show you in terms of a clay pot. It's ideal to have drainage in the container. And in a clay pot, you can see the hole here. This must remain open at all times to prevent overwatering. Now we say, why worry about overwatering? This goes along with the whole idea of respiration and nutrient absorption. When the soil is saturated with water, these cannot function. In fact, they are very likely to suffocate or die. Losing the roots then means that we can neither pick up moisture with the root system nor the nutrients that are in the soil. So we're going to lose that part of the function of the plant. So we have to have drainage, and that is coupled to the watering practices. And this we have to always keep in mind, that we do not at any time overwater, but rather provide for just the right amount. Which leads me to this suggestion. How do you know when to water? Well, there's one answer to that particular problem. All plants are different. Every plant that we might be growing in the home has a different watering requirement. As you can see, the size of the pot is also going to make a very significant difference as to the frequency of water. How do we tell? Sensitivity. Place your finger on the soil, hold it there a minute. If you begin to feel a coolness, you take it out and you feel a coolness on your finger, then you can be pretty sure that there's some moisture present. Probably at that time, at the moment, it does not need to have any watering going on. Now, another way of looking for water is what we call a bell. You can hear a ring pot in a dry pot. When that pot is saturated with water, it'll just be sort of a thud, have that bell-like quality. That's another way to tell whether or not you need to water at a given time. Now, there's another complication as far as watering is at the beginning, that we have the problem of working with some of the most adverse conditions. Okay, the next one has to do with the movement of air within the room. It's winter, and we have the heat on, and we have what's called convection air, which is a forced air, hot air system. Now, we want to put the plants in front of the window, so we've got plenty of light, but where is the register? Where is the heat source? Okay, you answer that one yourself. It's right where the plant is. We have hot air moving up around the plant in such a way it's going to lose water more quickly than there was no air movement. That's one situation. Another one is that hot water register. Again, it's a matter of convection movement air, hot air is low in humidity circulating around the plant. Now, we can overcome that by watching our watering very carefully. And there's another little gadget here that we can use, which is called a syringer. It's a matter of spraying a little water onto the plant, maybe 2 or 3 times a day. Good idea just to have it handy or convenient. But when we see the plants maybe going into wilting condition a little bit, hey, give it a little water into the air. That'll do the trick, at least for a very short time. And if you live with your plants, this is no problem because you want them to grow as best they can. Now, the other situation is one of working with conditioning. Here we are holding the temperature to a minimum at the same time as we are dehydrating the air with the air conditioning system. Again, it's a matter of being alert, being sensitive to plants. Some people say, well, how about talking to plants? Does that do it good? Well, you talk to a plant in a room where the plant isn't. Get in where the plant is and say, hey, do you need a little water? Look it over. And this way you'll begin to, let's say, do a dialogue at least with yourself, remind you to be sensitive to the plant's need for water. Now we'll go right along here to that of feeding plants. I suppose the misconception about feeding plants is that you can overcome all of the problems of growing plants by feeding. By misconception, I mean this, that as we have learned that a plant manufactures its own food, and that feeding the plant is a matter of providing for the building blocks. Those building blocks are nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, plus a whole list of minor elements. Now, merely giving it nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, we're leaving out the sunlight and carbon dioxide and so oxygen as very important building blocks in terms of the plant's nutrition. So anything that we do as far as feed is only supplementary to the whole physiology of the plant. It's providing that building blocks. How do we provide these building blocks? Well, there are a number of ways that we can. For most of it, the building blocks come in either a jar or a can or a packet or in a stick or in a tube, a number of ways that we'll find in the garden center as far as buying food is concerned. I'm less concerned actually about what kind of material, but at the fact that we're getting the right amount to the plant. Now, a couple things I want to go over again that we mentioned earlier as far as watering is concerned. You notice that this plant here has a very small reservoir both for water and for nutrients, so that the frequency here is going to be quite different than a large container, such as what we have on the prairie plant, which is a large volume of soil. So the frequency here is to be different just because the volume of nutrients that are available to the plant and how these are going to be used by the plant. We can say in a categorical sense, I just love categorical, it doesn't mean too much, except to say that flowering plants generally require a higher level of nutrient supplementation than do foliage plants. We can look at when we're growing something like a geranium, chrysanthemum, or cyclamen, a number of plants that we might grow in the home that are flowering plants, that the utilization is going to be higher. Now, the amount we are going to provide at any one time is open for some discussion. First of all, never exceed directions that are contained. I once heard a speaker relating to the label, and he said that this is probably the most expensive piece of literature that has been created. The millions of dollars of research that go into develop a product or to develop any kind of label, astronomical. We should not necessarily ignore it just on an economic basis, but rather it is important to follow directions precisely because this is how this is designed to work as a fertilizing material. That's true. They're using, happens to be an inorganic, utilizing ammonium nitrate and urea as a nitrogen source. Then it has bone meal in for phosphorus and potash in there for the potassium. This one here is another type of inorganic form, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, but use a different kind of formulation for the plant. Both of these are mixed with water. They are applied to the surfaces of the soil. One question that is very important, and this can be done very, very easily, is in fertilizing, take a pencil, if nothing else, or a screwdriver and actually make some holes down in the pot so that we're not just applying the fertilizer to the surface, rather it's getting down throughout the pot. I think you'll find that this will be helpful as far as the fertility is concerned. Now, most homes are uneven. That is, we can't say across the board that every Tuesday of the week is the day of the week you should feed your plants. This is a question, again, of being sensitive. As I mentioned in the first program, know what a healthy plant looks like. Like this one, for example. The leaves are a bright green. They're showing good color. There is very little yellowing in it. We know from that what it should look like. If it begins to look like this one over here, where we have a shrivel, we've got necrosis, we've got all something has really gone wrong as far as that is concerned. I want them to get that far from being of perfection to sustain them through our feeding program. When we begin to see a lightening of the foliage, that is yellowing, then say, well, gee, have I fed that plant lately? If the answer is no, then come in with your fertility program and do some supplementary feeding. This way, we're not overfeeding at any time, but we're anticipating the plant's needs. And as I have mentioned several times, this is the essence of how we go about a fertility program. Now, with plants growing very, very slowly, let's look at the group of the Cacti. Usually they have the lowest level of requirement as far as fertility is concerned. They also have the lowest requirement as far as moisture is concerned. So as a group, we can say, well, we can only need to feed them on a rather well-spaced basis, maybe once or twice a year at the most. As on plants like flowering plants, we're going to feed them more frequently, and the foliage plants probably become sort of middle as far as the feeding program is concerned. With the African violet and the Swedish ivy, I'd like to introduce the topic of plant propagation. First of all, for plant propagation, you need a place to do propagation. An easy way to do that in the home is to take just a common plastic flower pot, fill it with vermiculite, which is a sterile material, and just a common household plastic bag that you may have for canned freezing or storage or even putting your lunch in. These three items are all you need for a little home propagation. The next thing is taking the cutting. And all we're going to do today is take a simple cutting and put it into the vermiculite. Make a little hole into the vermiculite and insert it. Now this is called a stem cutting. At the same time, we can do the same thing with the African violet. Take a leaf, as I guess this is called leaf cutting. Cut a good clean end on it. And again, make a little hole into the vermiculite, insert it, and then the next step is to simply put the plastic bag over the top. Now, why the plastic bag over the top? It's simply to hold in the moisture. Remember now that when we discuss the matter of translocation and transpiration, we didn't want to lose water. Recognizing that it doesn't have any roots, it has to be taken in actually through the leaf tissue and a little bit through the stem tissue. We have to maintain the turgidity of the plant. Now, a more complicated method of propagation is what we call air layering. And I brought a plant with me to the studio to show you exactly how to do that particular operation. First, let me explain what an air layer is. Actually, it's a way of propagating a plant at the same time as a plant is growing. Whereas we're not going to cut it off the root system, which is growing down here in the pot, but rather we're going to grow roots up here on the side of the plant. The thing that we've done is to provide some extra support for the plant. We've put these bamboo rods in here on two sides because it's a very heavy plant to support while these new roots are growing. Now the next step, this is the most difficult part of the whole operation, is to make the incision. That is, we're going to cut through the central trunk about 3/4 of the way, and this will give us a break, and it's at this point where the new root system will develop. So picking up the scalpel and going to the plant, we're going to make this cut right across here. Advisedly, we should be using a good strong knife, and we are also going to have a good sharp knife. Now we've got that about 3/4 of the way through. Now the next step is to make an incision here so that little chip will hold the wound open so that we have the growth of roots coming out at this point here. Now the next one is to keep the moisture, to keep the wound damp. And what we have is sphagnum moss, which is wet. And it's very, very moist. And we're going to wrap this around the trunk of the plant. And to do this, it's just a matter of taking the plastic, hopefully having enough hands, and putting it right around here. Now we're going to tie this up good and tight so it'll hold the moisture in. Then with the system, we're going to tie it top and bottom. Now if you missed a couple of the steps in here, actually the how to do it of the layer is in the Houseplants Bulletin. Also, the care of the Houseplant Bulletin is plants that you can use in various orientations. And you'll find that in the bulletin as well. Now, having done our layer, we have the bottom plant and we have the top plant. So now instead of one Dieffenbachia, we have two Dieffenbachias. This is the story of growing plants indoors. We've looked at photosynthesis, we've looked at respiration, transpiration, translocation, and nutrient absorption. All concerns that we have in terms of growing plants in the home.
Home Landscape Gardening is a University of Minnesota Division independent study course. To enroll for 4 university credits, telephone during business hours 36925 or write TIS 21 Westbrook Hall, 77 Pleasant Street Southeast, University of Minnesota, Minneapolis, Minnesota 55455. If you wish to follow the program automatically by purchasing a study guide, you may do so by calling 376-4925. Home Landscape Gardening is a University of Minnesota Television independent study course presented by Continuing Education and Extension. To enroll for university credit, listen to the announcement at the end of the program. Home Landscape Gardening, a course designed to help the home gardener learn and gain confidence in principles of horticulture. The course is taught by C. Gustav Hard, Professor of Horticultural Science and Landscape Architecture at the University of Minnesota.
Is man's home his castle? That's sort of the topic that we're going to be dealing with. First of all, I think we have to keep in mind that for many, many centuries, man has found shelter, and this is what he has called home. It's only in the more recent history that he has begun to say to himself, what can I do to make this place a more comfortable place to live, and also a more beautiful place to live? In doing this, he seeks out many different kinds of elements. And we would have to say that throughout history, these elements have been changing to bring us where we are today. Now there's another aspect to this also in relationship to our whole program series. First of all, we're saying that if man is going to adapt his environment unto himself, then we have to understand what kinds of things he can be in charge of within that environment to make it work for him. In this case, we're talking about horticulture. We're talking about the adaptation of trees and shrubs and flowers and many elements to make them work for him in terms of beauty and also in terms of function. It's also interesting to note that when we begin to plan, that the word function is also can be substituted for the word workability. And if a design doesn't work, then indeed we have to ask ourselves the question, is there beauty at all? In order to illustrate this, I think we should take a step backwards in history just for a moment, and there we can see where we have been and perhaps better understand where we are going. If we look back to the picturesque period, which in this particular illustration will give us an idea of where we are, it tells us that for many, many years we have been looking at the idea that the house or home is the focus point of interest. What we're doing is picture painting with plants. And when we picture paint, what we're doing is looking at the artistic forms, the textures, the colors, the foreground, the background, and all of this sort of thing in order to come up with a visible frame in which we can step back and say, this indeed is a beautiful picture. Now, as we move forward in history, we begin to look more at the idea of how do we integrate our daily lives into this scene. And this we do through the introduction of many different kinds of elements. I suspect most of us are kind of guilty of taking that Sunday afternoon ride, of going down Main Street and looking at a series of homes. And we say to ourselves, well, there's one that I like, or there's one that I don't like, and we have to ask ourselves, well, how do we make this kind of relationship as far as these homes are concerned? Some will have a very comfortable look. Well, what makes for comfort in terms of a design, the landscape design? Others will have a very, let's say, cool appearance. Well, what makes for a very cool appearance? That which we can relate to. This sort of thing tells us then that as we move along the street, move through neighborhoods, that we relate to the landscape in particular ways. A lot of this has to do with pure aesthetics. Much of it has to do with pure function. We have to keep in mind, too, that man is a very peculiar kind of animal. That is, he looks for security. Security is that element which simply says, I can get into that home and find shelter. And this goes all the way up from the time you leave the street until you actually go into the front door. If we can relate to the property in terms of shelter, in terms of comfort, then we have achieved one of the first roles as far as the functional relationship of the design is concerned. In this model, there are several things that we can learn about how to go about planning the landscape. So what I'd like to do is to sort of walk through this home and into the home, out of the home, and look at some of the many features that might be beyond the home itself. So let's first of all go in the front door. You'll notice that the door is recessed. And first of all, I might just make this comment that usually when we have an area here to the front of the home, that this gives a sense of security, a sense of involvement, both visually and functionally. So that as we come into the home or into the living room, then we'll notice that we can see out of the front of the house itself, coming out through a bay window. Now this actually is looking out into what we're going to learn to be the public area, that area which is facing the street. Now this poses some problems in design actually, because we don't really want to look at the street itself. But from the inside of the home, we want to have this visual contact to the outside. And I suppose in a very serious way, we'd like to have some kind of contact from the outside to the inside. But we do have a room here that has this visual interrelationship going on. Then we might also move through and, let's say, into the dining room area. Again, you'll see that there is a picture window, so that if we're in this particular area, that we're going to be looking out to an area to the outside. Well, to increase or improve the dining pleasure, then it would seem that we should have, again, a good exterior relationship that might be built up through backgrounds in the landscape outside or into that space beyond the dining room itself. Also going out into the family room area, which is this area out here and is a projection on the house itself. You'll notice that it's well blessed with windows, so that we have an opportunity here to build up a very fine interior-exterior relationship as it relates to the vegetation or to the kinds of activities that this particular family might be interested in. Again, let's go down to, let's say, the bedroom wing of the home. We have here windows that will be looking out into the landscape itself. And the same thing is true here. What can we do in the exterior to give a useful view from the inside of the home to the outside? All of this is a concern, then, for the interior-exterior relationships. Now, as we begin to plan the space that is around the outside of the home, there are a number of things that we have to keep in mind. First of all, if you're going to develop this plan, you want to be sure that you have established the lot line. This lot line may be out here in the foreground, it might be close to the back, it might be a very deep lot, or it may be a very narrow lot. There are many different shapes and forms that lots will take. I just might say that the tendency now is to have a more narrow but deeper lot, and there's some very good reasons for that because of property taxes and a number of other things. Cost of utilities and establishing lots is much cheaper on a narrower lot. Now, the other thing that we want to work on in terms of developing a plan is to be sure that we have the proper orientation put onto the plan so that we know which way is north, which way is south, and east and west. And this is one of the things that I will be looking for in looking at your plans in the future. Now, there's good reason for that, and this goes back to what I mentioned earlier, the adaptations of horticulture. The kinds of things, let's say, that we would put here on the south side of the house would be quite different than what we would put on the north side of the house. So we have to look at this horticulturally. Shade-loving plants require less sun as far as the process of photosynthesis is concerned than those that need full sun, which would be on the south side or the west side of the house, and not to mention the east side of the house at the same time. Another thing that we want to be sure to look at has to do with the views, not only from the inside of the house, but also off and beyond the house itself. In other words, if we have, let's say, bought a lake lot, and our primary view that we want to maintain, either from the inside or from one of the working areas outside of the house, say that we're sitting here in this family room area, then where we locate things beyond this should not obstruct the view, but complement the view that we might get coming through these windows and out, let's say, as the lake would form the background. Or it might be a view over a meadow, or it might be into a wooded area. There are a number of things. Or we may just be creating a view on the site itself, either through naturalizing or through flower borders and other elements. So we want to take these into account into our plan. Initially, we should just write those right onto the plan and say, here is a view that I want to save. Or let's look at it from another way. here is a view that I don't want to say. Maybe it's the neighbor's garbage cans, or maybe it's a traffic situation or a parking situation. Or maybe it's the need for privacy. This is another element that we have to look at. What kind of lifestyle is this family actually going to have? What kinds of things do you like to do out of doors? So that when we look at views from off the site, neighbors, or you might be next to, let's say, a shopping center, apartments and so forth, what kinds of exposures do you have in relationship to the kind of activities? Let's say, for example, that you want to have a swimming pool. Well, you don't always like to be in full view when you're sunbathing, or if you're having a party, this sort of thing. You like to have that sense of privacy, that this is yours, and the kinds of activities that you're conducting within that space belong to you and belong to the property, and not be under the visual restrictions as far as what might be occurring off-site. So this sort of thing is something that we have to be looking at and mark onto the plan even before we begin to plant trees and shrubs and this sort of thing. Another aspect is that of environmental control. When we're looking at environmental control, we're saying to ourselves this: I want to have a cool, shaded area, let's say, for the patio. To get this, where do I place a tree? Where do I locate that tree? Well, obviously, we have to look again first at the orientation. Where is the sun pattern going to be at a given time of day when you might want to be using a patio area? This we have to, will vary according to the kind of orientation you have. If it's north, on the north side of the house, then we have to keep in mind that generally speaking, the shadow is going to be cast during the hottest part of the day to the north of the tree, or to the northeast of the tree as the sun moves around at our particular location. So trace that pattern onto your plan and say, well, now look, here is where I want the shade at the time of day that I'm going to use it. So we have to make those kinds of projections. Another way, another thing that we should be considering as we work on this plan is the divisions of areas. Divisions of areas give us workspace. I think most of us are used to planning on this basis. Just as we walk through the house, we had, first of all, a living area, the living room, for example, which has particular functions in the design of the home. Or if we go into the kitchen provides a place to prepare a meal. Certainly we don't do that in the living room. Or the dining room has a very specific space function. And as we go into the family room, again, this has its own space function. And I'd like to carry that concept through to the outside so that as we plan, we're looking at functions as well. The first planning area is that of the public area, which should occur on your plan. This says that this area is going to be viewed by the public, it's going to be the access into the home by the public, and it is also going to serve functions relating to that space. For example, parking. This is an important part of getting into the home. The automobile is one of the most functional relationships. Going back 10 years, we might have said, well, how on earth are we going to landscape an automobile? Well, now we accept the automobile as part of the design. Part of the driveway itself is part of the use function that we find in the design. It's what we are accepting in a historical sense now that we might not have, as short a period of time as 10 years ago, we said, well, we've got to come in through the alley. Within this public area, then we have this intermix. And I might just put this in for good measure. If we're going to have a strip of concrete in front of the house, why not make that multiple use function? Use it for recreation at the same time as we're using it for public access into the home itself. And this we can do. And if it has to be a hard surface, bituminous or concrete, which is a very costly factor, then give it that kind of multiplicity of use for a good functional relationship here in the driveway, in addition to getting people into the home in the design. So the third element then, in terms of planning this public area, is that of putting together the aesthetic balance to give us what we traditionally have called the setting or the picturesque relationship, keeping in mind that function is a part, but also keeping in mind that we want to have it beautiful. So there we go, we'll turn to the art elements, that of texture, color, form, as a way of building up this kind of a picture presentation in the public area. The second area that I want to speak of then is the private area. Private is exactly what it says. Here is a way of personalizing the kinds of things that we want to do in the landscape. If it's a matter of swimming pool, which I mentioned earlier, if it's a matter of the kind of gardening that we do, the flower border, this sort of thing, developing the interior-exterior relationships to the home, the whole matter of recreation that we can develop within this private area, this pulls out of the public area and personalizes this area for our use. By doing this, then we are into a setting that is designed specifically for the given family. This is something that we can relate to and does not necessarily follow through on all of the rules that we might set up for the development of the public area. The third area then is the service area. The service area might be combined into the private area, but there are times when we need such things as storage. We need a place to put extra, like boats, house trailers, and this sort of thing into the landscape. And to do this, if we can assign space to that, then we can say, all right, here in this location, in this design, is the service area. So let's just go back and summarize now, just briefly, the content of design. First of all, we want to have it laid out in such a way that we are giving it full horticultural consideration. We're looking at the environmental controls of the plant material. So north is an important part of the plan. The next thing we want to look at is that of saying the definition of areas. Public area, private area, service area, those three things. Now the next thing we want to be sure of is that we have established where we want to be in terms of visual control, both on the site and off the site. If we can do this, then we have begun to establish the space into which we can integrate all that we want to do as far as the landscape design. Not all planning is starting from scratch. What we discussed from the beginning has been a matter of saying, well, look, just moved into this home. We've done an analysis of everything that we want to do, and we'll go from there. However, not all landscape planning is exactly that way. Very often it's a matter of change that we're trying to affect as far as the landscape is concerned. that, for example, are trying to, let's say, develop a new screen or develop new flower gardens, this sort of thing. So we might look at that as just part of the overall landscape scheme as far as what we might do in the landscape planning. For example, when we change the flower border, you might find there that we would be having to relocate, putting in more plantings, changing the plantings under the eaves. And we might see also that we might use some background plantings to give us a more effective visual control as far as the lot and the lot relationships are concerned. This kind of change, I think, is important, and I think if we can affect this in a design, then we can come out with something that is going to look more like this. There you see that with the establishment of the grass, the reorganization of the beds, we have better control also of the background. In this way, a little change, a little planning for change can revamp your whole landscape without spending either a lot of money, but most importantly, bringing it into the kind of use pattern that makes it more functional as far as the total design is concerned. Now, there's one other area that I'd like to speak of, and that has to do with what we would call the demographic information, or the social information concerning the landscape. This has to do with the age of the people who might be involved. Is this a young couple that's just moving into a house with no children, or is it an older couple that might be in the retirement age? The kinds of things that you would be including into the design would be quite different for these two classifications, young, old. The other thing has to do with the children. What ages are they? What kind of things are going to be necessary as far as that kind of planning is concerned? Is a sandbox a part of the needs? Is a play area a part of the needs? As the children grow older, what kinds of other activities can be planned as far as the landscape is concerned? This is social activity. Another way of looking at it is the interest of the family. There's a lot of the interest center away from the home. Is the father or husband in the family a golfer? Or maybe it's a man and wife team who like to spend their weekends on the golf course. The kinds of design that would be appropriate for this kind of a family would be much different than one who are avid lovers of flowers. Flowers being one of those elements in the landscape that require a good deal of time. Another way of looking at it is whether or not the children's interest is centered in the home. Idealistically, I suppose we'd like to say, well, mowing the lawn is the #1 sport. But on the other hand, if they are involved in many activities away from the home, then how much can we be dependent upon the relationship to the landscape itself? Another aspect has to do with that of the handicap. We can do special things in the landscape as far as the handicapped are concerned. The movement around the lot, how we change the elevations from one side of the house to the other, whether we're going to use ramps or steps. All of this can be programmed into the landscape design if we take into account the social data, the social ability as far as the family is concerned. Another relationship that we should give special recognition to is that of hobbies. Many people have gardening hobbies. They like to do special things. For example, some people like to, let's say, grow their own vegetables. That first fresh tomato coming out of the landscape is all important. Where then can we locate the garden within the landscape so that we can have the first fresh tomato in the neighborhood? Well, obviously, from a horticultural point of view, we need an area where there is warm soil. We need it where there's plenty of sun. So this becomes a horticultural dictum that says that this is where the vegetable garden is going to have to be for this particular family. Another hobby relationship is specialty. Some people enjoy growing roses. Others might be dahlias or gladiolas, a number of flowering plants that may not be grown just for their landscape value, but rather for their competitive value, the matter of being a perfectionist with a given kind of horticultural material, whether it's flowers or vegetables or even fruit. So this is some of the social information that we need to look at as far as the landscape development is concerned. As we move on, we also have to plan for change that relates to this social data, recognizing the fact that children, as they grow older, are going to change their interests. I mentioned earlier about the multiple use of the driveway as one way of meeting a recreational need in the landscape. At an earlier age, maybe Foursquare is the game that's number one in the neighborhood. As the children grow older, then perhaps either badminton or tennis or even a basketball hoop can become an important part of the recreational feature for the driveway itself. Looking at the transitional relationship as we go from one age to the next age and the capabilities that children might have. So these are some of the things that we have to look at then in terms of landscape planning. Remember, the plan is a guide. It's the framework into which many things are going to happen. And I think if you look at it as a space allocation and spaces that relate to other spaces that are connections one with the other, then we can do a good job of landscape planning.
Home Landscape Gardening is a University of Minnesota Television independent study course. To enroll for 4 university credits, telephone during business hours 376-4925 or write TVIS 27 Westbrook Hall, 77 Pleasant Street Southeast, University of Minnesota, Minneapolis, Minnesota 55455. If you wish to follow the program systematically by purchasing a study guide, you may do so by calling 376-4925.
terms of where we are when looking at trees for the landscape. We something we want to keep and preserve into that landscape. Of the mass effect. Trees have that way of making a home feel at home on a piece of land. This is a matter of balance and proportion in the design. So if we're dealing with the beginning point, no trees, one of the things that we want to do is to establish, make that statement, unity between the architecture and the home lot itself. The third thing we're going to be looking at, of course, is the matter of energy conservation. This is about from two directions. First of all, let's look in the summer context. Trees have a way of cooling. In fact, one tree has been said to be worth a 10-ton capacity air conditioner. A more understandable way of saying the same thing is that a tree has a capacity of cooling about 10 degrees. And I think most of us have experienced this sort of phenomenon when we've been out for a walk. You're walking in the hot sun and suddenly you stand underneath of a tree. It feels cool. It isn't just a matter of being out of the direct sunlight. It's also a matter of the evaporation, the cooling effect, the air conditioning, the built-in air conditioning effect that a tree actually has. The other thing, that the overhang of a tree onto a piece of property tends to prevent the radiation and absorption from the effect of the sun, which then also tends to cool the building itself. Another way of looking at it from the winter aspects, a tree can blow wind. It can cut back on the penetration of the wind into the home, both as you open the door or even up under the shingles or through the window, any cracks and crevices that might be there. Anytime that we can reduce the wind velocity, we're going to reduce the effect of the wind and the cold penetration at the same time. So energy conservation is something that we should be looking at in terms of putting together a landscape design. Trees serve many of these particular purposes. One other thing that I think we should keep in mind is that trees are very personal. Most everyone knows at least a half a dozen kinds of trees, and most all of us know the trees that are indigenous to where we were born, and so that we sort of have this kind of kindred relationship through trees, which we may not have with any other kind of plant material. So when we get design, we want to try to make that transition into our new property, our new home, through what we have known in the tradition of our family or the tradition of our background. In this way, we can have a more meaningful kind of landscape setting and at the same time do a much better job in terms of preparing the landscape plan. There's one other thing that I might mention, and that is that when we are selecting trees, we want to be sure that we are not necessarily violating the trees of the community. By violating, I simply mean we want to have a continuous unity of trees throughout the community. By doing, let's say that we have maple as a dominant species within a community. And there's nothing wrong with choosing maple as maybe one of our trees. So we're bridging the gap between properties as we go along the street so that we sense this kind of unity, this sense of continuity as far as the community is concerned. Now to the specifics of a tree. Actually, there are several things that we should keep in mind. The first one is that we want to get trees that have some meaning and still serve a function in the design. Now, we'll make the assumption that you know nothing about trees, and that seems rather remote, but let's take that position anyway. Probably one of the first things you should do is to pick up a catalog. And there are a number of nurseries in your area where you can actually go and say, hey, how about a catalog for free? And there are various kinds of catalogs. You'll find some that have flowers, that accent flowers, some that will accent trees, some that are a combination of both. But the important thing is that we build up a repertoire or library so that we have resources necessary in order to begin the process of elimination to get to the trees that we want. Another good source of information would be university publications. Woody Plants for Minnesota, for example, is one of those publications that you can use. Here you find a listing according to the hardiness, and I want to speak about hardiness a little more thoroughly. But winter hardiness, we need to keep that in mind. The university publications tend to give you information on the hardiness factor as well as a brief description of the tree itself, its characteristics, its bark, its foliage, its flowering, its fruiting, and so forth. So that we need to build up this repertoire or library of information sources so that when we sit down to plan, when we sit down to actually pick out the tree for a location, we've got all of these resources available to us. Now, the next thing I want to keep in mind is that of trying to buy trees that are proportionate to the space that we have, recognizing that we're dealing with an average city lot. A city lot, incidentally, is about 1,000 square feet, more or less. But we're dealing with a relatively small section of space. And keep in mind, too, that in the functional use of that space, we have the house, we have the driveways, entry rooms, the patio, places where we cannot necessarily grow trees. So that about a third of that space, the 10,000 square feet, are already consumed again to plant trees. So judging from the size of the lot, then, we have to say, well, now this tree is going to be too large, or maybe this one's going to be too small. But within the framework of proportion, you have to choose trees that are going to fit. We don't want to overstate trees. That is, make the house seem a secondary element in the design. There should be a good balance between the tree forms and architectural forms. And this is what I call artistic judgment. However, with a little practice and the use of mock or models, you can very easily see what is going to be too tall and what's going to be too small. Now, the next thing we want to look at as a way of using trees is that we want to build up a foliar contrast. We want to have interest and variety in the landscape. First of all, look at this honey locust. The honey locust is a very finely divided type leaf, giving us a very fine texture as far as the landscape effect is concerned. In this, when we use this, it's going to give us a light shade pattern. It's also going to give us a lacy effect as far as the landscape effect is concerned. The next one let's look at then is that of the sugar maple. The sugar maple then would be a coarse textured material. It has a very sharply defined leaf, some lobing. There are other trees that have no lobing and leaves the same size that come off even coarser in textural form. But you can see the sharp contrast then that we develop when we put these kinds of materials together. Not only do we have a little color contrast, but we also have this textural interrelationship which builds a considerable amount of interest as far as the landscaping is concerned. The textural concern is one of the things that we should keep in mind in terms of our tree selection. Not that we have to have necessarily a coarse texture, medium texture, and fine texture, but we do want to get the variety because we have to keep in mind much of the season for landscape effect is a matter of monocolor, green being our color elected. When we look at the fall effects, this changes. Through most of the growing season, we have just green. And so that texture then becomes that element which brings out the variety within the plantings that we would like to have. Another criteria for selection then is also that of the use of seasonal change. Seasonal change beginning in the spring of the year, into the summer, and then into the fall. And if we can look at this in the context of seasonal change, learn how to make these kinds of observation, building up that kindred relationship to the plant materials which make you feel at home on the property. It's sort of interesting, in some cultures, the breaking of the bud is akin to new life. So there's always that expectancy that goes on through the winter of that breaking of bud, that harbinger of spring, as it's called, which says, spring is coming, and you look ahead with this kind of a relationship in terms of the landscape. Now, I'd like to look at this in a little closer detail and using some tape segments to illustrate this particular point. It's spring, not fall. The colors that you're experiencing in this panoramic view are that of the flowers of the sugar maple, the oak, the ash, perhaps even the birch. Trees can be as interesting in the spring of the year just from the show of bloom as they can in the fall from their color. This is a matter of learning close observation in order that we can put together this kind of a scene. Here we see the same scene in the summertime. You notice how all of the shrubs are now out in full leaf and how the trees take on a different form. This is the sort of thing that we like to see when we can make these kind of comparisons from the summer, spring aspects. With the close-up of the flowers, we can see more of the detail that was being put together in terms of the overall view. Actually, the flowers on trees are very showy if we take the time to look at them. And of course, following the flowers comes fruiting. Here we see the fruit of the flowering crabapple. The color here is very vibrant and it's an interesting effect. And interestingly enough, it lasts long into the fall of the year. There are many fruits that provide for this color in the landscape. This is because of white bark and also because of its medium texture foliage. It shows well both in the landscape during the summer and very often in the winter as well. We find that if we grow it on the north side, it does much better. The Norway maple is another colorful tree, especially in the spring when it has maroon foliage. Later on in the summer, the foliage begins to turn to a dark green, and then comes on in the fall bright gold. We find also that it's well adapted to many uses as far as the land. Most common shade trees that we grow. The reason for this is because of its versatility. It makes a good fruiting tree, it has good texture quality, its foliage is a dark green, and the leaves are glossy. You'll notice the extraordinary evergreens in general we like to use for their winter effect. It also makes good background, and the spring use is extraordinary. As we look further, we can find that the detail gives us interesting use in the landscape. The basswood or American linden is also a very good tree. It's a large tree, and we need lots of space in the landscape in order to grow it. For this, it isn't as commonly grown in the landscape as it might. The flowering crabapple is good for the beginning of the year. It's what we might call the harbinger of spring. That is, it's one of the earliest flowering trees in the landscape. We also use it for its heating effect because it usually has very dense foliage. Also, following along in the summer, we have the flower following with the fruit, and the fruit then hang on into the autumn. Also, we find that the cedar waxwings come along in the winter and eat. Another characteristic we should look at with trees is that of bark. Bark is one identifying, but more importantly, it gives us an overall feeling about the tree itself. This is the bark oak, particularly the bur oak. You'll find that with this one, you get a very coarse texture and a very dark texture. There's another one that is very interesting in that it has a very colorful bark for winter show. It's a soft texture and a very fine texture, and gives us a very different feeling from the white birch. White birch, you'll find, doesn't give you the same kind of effect because we don't get together different. It's nice summer and against the sort of a monochromatic scale. But we like to grow the birch because it is our native trees here in Minnesota. Another one that we might look at is that of the cork tree. The cork is a very thick bark tree and gives you a very fine texture, even though it has this thickness about it. When you look at the cork tree, you suddenly feel that you're looking at a very massive material, and this way you get a very special impression. Ecology. First of all, we have to realize that the trees that we're going to be growing in our landscape come from various locations, either from native conditions or perhaps from other parts of the country. In order to get them to grow and to flourish and do their very best, we have to be sure then that we're giving them the right adaptation as far as the soil, moisture level, and perhaps even soil temperature that we might have in our particular landscape. One way of illustrating this point would be with the white birch. The white birch is native in sections of Minnesota, and yet when we bring it into the landscape, we have an atypical situation. For example, usually you find birch growing in clumps, that is in a free stand interspersed with perhaps balsam or fir. Then you find that when you do this, that you have a very heavy or cover as far as the soil is concerned. Very often you'll have a very thick leaf mat over the root system, which tends to keep the root system very cool. Now, supposing that you were going to use in your landscape plan the birch, then where would you find this kind of a condition, ecological condition for the birch in the plan? Well, first of all, it would not occur on the south side of the house. This would be the warmest location and probably also the driest location. You'll find, too, that the soil moisture relating to this particular condition will be a factor to consider. Where can we use it more effectively? Usually, we'll find that on the north side of the house, where the roots are in the shade of the house itself, that we can grow the birch more successfully. And very often you'll see this dramatized on streets that are running east and west. You'll find on the side of the street the white birch growing very well, but on the north side of the street, which is the south facing, for that orientation, the birch will have either died or will be doing very, very poorly. So that we have to look at the ecological conditions under which we're going to be growing trees. Another situation, one where we might have gravel underlay, the soil type. Soils tend to be quite droughty. Another situation is very sandy soil. When the soils are sandy, they're going to dry out rather rapidly. The only way to overcome these kinds of situations is to, first of all, get the deep-rooted trees, those that are going to penetrate down into the water table, or be assuring that we have to give them extra water during the growing season. If we do this, then we can grow many, many things on these kinds of soil types quite readily. Another thing, looking at the ecology, is to try to get to duplicate associations. That is, what species tend to grow together? What kind of format can we put together to say, well, now this becomes an ecological grouping? I often find that on high and dry land that the willow is often try to grow the willow, particularly the weeping willow. Well, actually, the willows have a water association, and many of them will tolerate water over the roots part of the season, at least during the spring, thaw, spring thaws are taking place and the snow is leaving. However, rarely is this a permanent thing, so that during the growing season then, and throughout the summer and fall, very often the tree is left high and dry without any water association. So we like to sort of have sort of a synergism of effect. That is, where we're using water-loving trees where water is present on the property. And there are many sites, particularly lake sites, which is very perfectly good taste, but it's also good ecology. Now, if we think about this sort of thing and read further on how we can put together ecological associations and find how these trees are going to respond with particular soil types, then we also get into a situation of lower maintenance. And the whole energy conservation ties into how much maintenance we have to apply to a given species. The other point that should be made is that as we landscape and we're looking for low maintenance to give us time for alternative things, the more adapted a species is to the landscape plan, the less time we're going to have to spend as far as the maintenance is concerned. So this idea of ecology is one of those things that we have to watch carefully and plan for as we're developing the landscape plan. Now there's one other use of trees that I'd like to mention, and that is for framing. And to illustrate that, I'd like to work with a model. Trees in the landscape. That point is this. We use trees for framing. Like a picture, when we're creating the landscape scene, we need to finish it up, giving it a frame that focuses the attention onto the scene itself. By judiciously putting trees into the landscape scene, we can create this effect. Where do they go? Well, first of all, we need to work out here to the sides, and usually at about a 10 to 15 degree angle and forward each corner of the house. So this would be out into this angle and to this angle. Now, this works out very nicely on most new plantings. But supposing you live in an area where there are a number of trees already in the landscape or in the public area we have discussed. This means then that we're not necessarily talking about adding more trees, but using the ones that are. Another situation is this. Often there are already trees in the boulevard plantings. We have to look at the location of those, where they are placed in relationship to how this fits the landscape scene. If they're out at the angles or if they're in front, this already provides us with a depth measurement to give us some depth in terms of the landscape planning itself. In our discussions now about selecting trees, we have been talking about how we might use them in the landscape. We've also been talking about some of the characteristics. There's one more idea that I would like to say, and we'll say this from time to time about all plant materials. We want to be sure that these are trees that are hardy, that will grow not only under cold conditions, but under droughty conditions or under conditions of acute pollution. Again, where do we find information? It's a good idea to use the publications, to visit the garden store operator or with the nurseryman, or we can go to an arboretum and talk to the people there that are growing these trees for the landscape. Or we can look at research that has been done on various trees in order to establish the kind of knowledge that we need to know about their selection. Most all trees that are published in university publications have been tested or tried and can have that kind of endorsement. Very often, when we're looking through newspapers and magazines and other publications, you'll find ads for trees that might be quite exotic, trees that are not necessarily commonly grown, but are offered at a very reasonable figure. How do we handle this kind of a situation? Well, first of all, I want to get all the information about this particular tree before I order it or would buy it. Secondly, if you know limitations of it and you want to use it experimentally in your landscape, then I would say don't use it in a key location, but rather in a place for that purpose. And then once it has proven itself in your landscape, then if you want to move it to another location and grow it permanently, this would be something that you can do. Keep in mind then with trees that we're looking at the seasonal aspects, we're looking at the hardiness aspects, we're looking at the many uses such as screening, such as together textures. We're looking at the color, which can be very exotic, particularly in our cool climates. We're also looking tend to give us that unusual quality winter and summer in the landscape. So we can ask ourselves a question again: is a tree as a tree is a tree? Yes, if you're the one who is going out to buy it.